Canada is dangerously close to a problem most people think is already over. Inflation looks calmer. Interest rates are no longer crushing headlines every week. And after 2 brutal years, a lot of Canadians are trying to believe the worst is behind them. But that may be exactly when the next hit lands. Because all it takes now is one real oil shock. And suddenly, the price of living in Canada starts climbing again. Gas first, then groceries, then deliveries, then flights, then business costs. Then the quiet psychological shift that changes everything. People stop feeling like life is stabilizing and start bracing for another squeeze. And here's the part that makes this story more dangerous than it sounds. Canada is one of the world's biggest oil countries. So why would Canadians still get punished by a global oil spike? Why can a country that produces so much energy still feel poorer when oil jumps? And why might this next inflation wave hit at the exact moment the economy is already too weak to handle it? Canada's February 2026 CPI was 1.8%. The Bank of Canada held its policy rate at 2.25% on the 18th of March 2026. And Governor Tiff Macklem explicitly warned the Middle East war had raised risks through energy prices. Meanwhile, Brent crude has been trading around the low $100 cents after a violent March spike tied to disruption around the Strait of Hormuz. That is the contradiction at the center of this whole story. On paper, Canada looks better. In real life, it still feels fragile. Yes, headline inflation cooled, but food prices were still up 5.4% year-over-year in February 2026, and grocery prices alone were up 4.1%. Statistics Canada also notes, grocery prices are still more than 30% higher than they were in February 2021. So even before any fresh oil shock fully passes through the system, Canadians are already shopping in a country where normal got permanently more expensive. And the labor market is not giving households much cushion either. Canada's unemployment rate rose to 6.7% in February 2026. Ontario was at 7.6%. Real GDP in the fourth quarter of 2025 actually slipped 0.2%, and household debt remains extremely high, with debt to disposable income around 177% in late 2025. In plain English, this is not an economy with a lot of shock absorbers left. So now imagine what happens if oil doesn't just rise a little. Imagine it jumps hard, fast, and stays there. That's not some abstract fantasy anymore. Reuters reported this week that the disruption around the Strait of Hormuz has already become one of the biggest global supply shocks on record, with about 1/5 of the world's oil and LNG flows passing through that corridor. Brent has swung wildly, settled above $112 on March 20, then dropped, then rebounded back above $100 on March 24 as markets tried to price in war risk, damaged infrastructure, and uncertainty over whether shipping can normalize. Some banks are now modeling much higher upside scenarios if disruption lasts. And oil shocks never stay inside the energy sector. That's the mistake people make when they hear higher oil and think only about the gas station. No. Oil is transportation. Oil is logistics. Oil is agriculture. Oil is packaging. Oil is aviation. Oil is shipping. Oil is delivery fleets. Oil is the hidden cost inside almost everything that moves, gets refrigerated, gets imported, gets harvested, or gets brought to your neighborhood store. Which means the first number Canadians notice is usually gasoline. But the second wave is the one that hurts more. It shows up in produce that traveled by truck, in restaurant margins that were already thin, in small businesses that can't absorb another cost jump, in contractor invoices, in airline tickets, in heating-related costs, in the subtle reset of expectations where companies stop asking, "Can we avoid a price increase?" and start asking, "How much can customers tolerate?" That is how a fresh oil shock turns into broad inflation pressure, even when headline CPI looked tame a month earlier. And here is where Canada's situation gets weird. A lot of people assume Canada is protected because Canada produces oil. But producing oil is not the same thing as insulating consumers from global oil pricing. Canada is a major crude exporter, and according to Natural Resources Canada, it remains one of the world's biggest crude exporters. Much of that oil goes to the United States, and Canadian pricing is still tied to global markets. Eastern Canada has reduced its reliance on overseas crude in recent years, but refineries and fuel pricing still sit inside a broader North American and global system. Ontario, for example, gets most of its refinery crude from Western Canada, but imports still accounted for around 15% of refinery crude consumed between 2020 and 2023. So when global oil spikes, Canadians do not live in a bubble just because Alberta exists. This is the part many viewers will not like, but it matters. Sometimes a country can be rich in energy and still feel poor at the consumer level. Because the consumer does not buy national production. The consumer buys gasoline, groceries, heating, and transport inside a price system that reacts to global shocks. So yes, Canada can export energy and still import inflation. And this next part may be the biggest open loop in the whole story. What does the Bank of Canada do if oil-driven inflation comes back while the economy is already weak? Because that is the nightmare setup. If inflation rises because of energy, central banks face a trap. Cut rates, and they risk feeding inflation psychology. Raise rates, and they hit an economy that already has weak growth, high household debt, and rising unemployment. Hold rates, and families get squeezed anyway. That is exactly why the March 18 Bank of Canada decision mattered more than the headline suggested. The bank held at 2.25%, but it also made clear it is watching whether higher oil prices become persistent inflation. Reuters reported Macklem said the bank would raise rates if necessary to prevent that persistence. That's the real warning. Not that a hike is guaranteed, but that the rate cut relief era people were hoping for can disappear very quickly if energy rewrites the inflation story. And if that happens, Canada gets hit from both sides. Consumers pay more. Borrowers get less relief. Businesses face softer demand and higher input costs. Governments face more pressure. Confidence falls again. That last one matters more than most economists admit. Because inflation is not just math, it's behavior. When people think prices will keep rising, they rush purchases, delay savings, become more defensive, negotiate harder, tip less, travel less, eat out less, and start mentally downgrading their future. That mood spreads faster than policy can fix. And Canada is especially vulnerable to that mood shift because the population is already exhausted. After the housing shock, after the grocery shock, after the interest rate shock, after the feeling that every temporary price increase somehow stayed. So even if another oil spike does not recreate 2022 exactly, it could still do enough damage to revive the worst part of that period. The sense that life is getting more expensive again just when people were starting to breathe. And notice something else. This would not hit every Canadian evenly. Commuters get hit faster than downtown professionals who work from home. Small businesses get hit faster than giant chains. Lower-income households get hit harder because energy and food take a bigger share of their budget. Rural Canada gets hit differently than dense urban cores. And provinces already struggling with weaker job markets may feel the squeeze sooner. That is why a national inflation number can look not too bad, while real life feels much worse than the average suggests. A 1.8% headline CPI can coexist with 5.4% food inflation. A weak economy can coexist with expensive essentials. A country can produce oil and still feel an oil shock. That's the entire story in one sentence. Canada does not need a full inflation spiral to feel expensive again. It just needs energy to infect the rest of the system, one layer at a time. And here's the deeper reason this matters beyond the next few weeks. If oil volatility becomes the new normal, then Canada's affordability problem stops being just a housing story or just a grocery story. It becomes a resilience story. Can households survive another wave? Can small businesses survive another margin squeeze? Can policymakers fight inflation without breaking growth? Can a country rich in resources figure out how to keep its own cost of living from being hostage to global chaos? That is the question underneath the headline. Because the real danger is not only that gas prices jump, it's that one oil shock exposes how little room Canada has left. And once people realize that, expensive stops sounding like a phase. It starts sounding like the system. So yes, inflation cooled. Yes, the central bank paused. Yes, the worst-case scenario may still be avoided. But if oil stays elevated, or if the Middle East disruption worsens, Canada could relearn a very ugly lesson. You do not need a booming economy to get painful inflation. You just need a vulnerable one, plus energy shock, plus time. And that is why this story matters right now. Because what looks like a foreign conflict, a shipping disruption, or a commodity market story can very quickly turn into something much more personal: a more expensive commute, a more expensive grocery bill, a delayed rate cut, a tighter household budget, and one more year where Canadians work hard just to feel like they're standing still. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment what you think.